The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and protected the rights of African Americans. It was passed by the Senate on April 8, 1864, and by the House on January 31st, 1865. The 14th Amendment was created in 1868. It granted equal protection of the laws to all citizens born or naturalized, including former slaves. This led to the following Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, Plessy was an African-American train passenger who did not want to ride in a car for Negroes. He argued that his constitutional rights were being violated. The Supreme Court denied his argument and stated that the law that implied merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not unconstitutional. A picture that was drawn representing the train carts that were used for the people. One says for whites folks and the other one says Jim Crow car. Jim Crow laws. As a result, the Jim Crow laws were created. The Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation, also known as the Separate but Equal laws. The laws lasted for about 100 years until 1968. They were meant to prevent the African American people from voting, getting jobs, education, and other opportunities. The people who tried to go against the Jim Crow laws would encounter being arrested, jail time, or even death. As you can see in the images to my left, there is a picture of Jim Crow. Jim Crow imitated an African American man. On the bottom, you can see a picture where there's two separate water fountains. One says white and the other one says Negro. On the right, you can see a picture of an advertisement of one of the shows that Jim Crow made. Black codes were restrictive laws that forced African Americans to do cheap labor after slavery had ended. So basically what they did was they forced African Americans to sign contracts to get paid very little, and if they didn't want to sign the contracts, they would be forced into free labor. An activist that really stood out during this time was Ida B. Wells. She took a leadership role to fight against the Jim Crow laws. She was a co-owner of Memphis Free Speech and Headlights. She used this to her advantage and fought against sexual harassment and segregation. On the bottom, I put a little image that shows kind of what it was like, African Americans on one side and the whites on the other. The 15th Amendment was created in 1870, and it granted African American men to vote. Despite the amendment, by the late 1870s, discriminatory practices were used to prevent blacks from exercising their right to vote, especially in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1964. This was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in order to overcome legal barriers that kept African Americans from voting. As you can see in the image to your left, it says, "Voters take literacy test here." This was meant so that the African Americans who were former slaves that didn't know how to read could not vote. And even if they did get all the answers right, they still wouldn't let them vote.
Back to my channel. A video with the name of This Is America came out, and some of the dance moves Donald Glover did resembled Jim Crow. I decided to do a little bit of research to get to know who this guy really is. Make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to see more informational videos like this. Jim Crow was a character played by Thomas Dartmouth Rice. This guy was a white actor who dressed up as a black slave and acted as a dumb and clumsy character that was named Jim Crow. He would paint himself black and start singing and dancing. Rice would also speak in a quotation, "black way." He did this as a mockery towards African Americans. Rice created the character after seeing an elderly African American man singing a song called Jump Jim Crow in Louisville, Kentucky. The show became a huge hit, so Rice started touring across the United States and Britain. At the same time, the KKK started uprising and torturing former slaves. Some examples of what the KKK would do is burn people's houses down and tar and feather people that they thought didn't belong in America. Jim Crow's legacy continued until the 1970s. When the Jim Crow character died out, people eventually started using the phrase as a derogatory term for blacks. The term Jim Crow was applied to the body of racial segregation laws and practices throughout the nation, according to www.blackpast.org. Some of the Jim Crow laws included black codes. A lot of people still held a grudge against African Americans, so they made tests that the former slaves had to pass to be able to vote. Even if they got all of the questions right, they still wouldn't let them vote.
Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in school, employment, and public accommodations.
Racial segregation is a systematic separation of people into racial or ethnic groups in daily life. Segregation can involve spatial separation of the races and mandatory use of different institutions such as schools and hospitals. Segregation was made a law several times in the 18th and 19th century. America, some believed that black and white people were incapable of coexisting. There were many steps taken towards segregation. First step towards segregation came from the black codes. These codes and laws began to spread throughout the South. These codes gave blacks the ability for cheap labor. In 1996, Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that segregation was constitutional, which meant that ruling was separate but equal. In these images here, you can see how segregation happened, which was from color to white, and how segregation affected them also in school. The Equality Act forbids direct and indirect perspective and associative discrimination on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, beliefs, age, disability, sexual orientation, and gender reassignment. This is caused by the 14th Amendment, which took place in 1868. The bill was passed by the United States House of Representatives that would amend the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination. There were many executive orders. The first executive order was to increase employment. Executive Order 8802 and Executive Order 9001 require that all defense contracts contain a clause pursuant to which the contractor agreed to refrain from discriminating on the basis of race and national origin. The first executive orders addressing discrimination is private sector employment grew out of the unique labor market conditions created by America's entry in World War II. The executive conclusion that the eradication of discrimination is empirically related to economy and efficiency, and government contracting is a product of its expertise and is entitled to deference. As you can see, there has been a history of racial discrimination of various aspects of life, including education, employment, housing, public accommodations, and other areas. The Supreme Court has had a lot of cases due to racial discrimination starting from 1944. Some of these cases include Shelley v. Kramer, which took place in 1948, Brown v. Board of Education, which took place in 1954, and Loving v. Virginia, which took place in 1967. In the Shelley case, the decision held that racially restrictive covenants and property deeds are not enforceable. In this case, the covenants were terms or obligations and property that limited the property's rights to Caucasians and also excluding members of other race. The Brown v. Board of Education case was a landmark case. Court prohibits racial segregation of public schools. Loving v. Virginia case, the decision was that the state laws prohibiting interracial marriage are unconstitutional.